spoke very, very deeply, very honestly, very vulnerably about what he saw in his life and how alcohol nearly destroyed his family. And to have somebody at that level, Bhuvan
Yeah.
Bam is the hugest young star among
Yeah.
a certain age of young people in our country, people who have millennials who have grown up watching him, and Gen Zs today who are still huge fans of him. And for him to bring that bravery to a
Yeah.
conversation, and then there was a moment in that conversation. Bhuvan lost his parents during the pandemic, and I asked him if he's comfortable speaking about it. And he just paused, and he welled up. And it was a 1 minute pause that everybody on the internet is now, talking about, which we retained in its entirety.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to a brand new episode of Say Again with me, Amrita Tripathi. This week, I'm beyond delighted to be in conversation with a dynamic, thoughtful, really funny 38-year-old entrepreneur, writer, mental health advocate. He's a co-founder of and the chief of Yuvaa, Nikhil Taneja. Thank you so much for joining us. And I only highlight your age because I saw a post where you said you just turned 38 and you are also reverse aging, as you told one of your guests. So happy belated birthday, and thank you for joining this podcast.
Thank you for having me, Amrita. I've been a big fan of your work, all the books that you've written, all the work that you've done in the policy space. I've been following you and everything that you're doing to normalize the conversation around mental health. So honestly, like, really grateful to be here talking to you. And yeah, and I mean, I hope I also get to listen to you a little bit because, again, as I said, I've been very inspired by all the
Oh,
work that you've been doing.
thank you. That's so kind. Okay, that's a peak moment for me for this interview and series. I'm going to clip that one out. But I was, telling you, I was ever since I kicked off this podcast. It's only been 10 episodes, but I've just been thinking of getting you on because one of the things I'm really interested to talking to people about is, we talk to leaders, we talk to thought leaders, we talk to change makers, and of course that's really inspiring, right? Talking to people about their success stories, but it's also really inspiring, I think, to hear about what goes on behind the scenes. There are ups and downs everyone has to deal with, and I think you've been doing that so well. I mean, I've seen some of your posts where I'm just like, it's actually awesome to see on social media where it's the opposite is a normal, right? The opposite is a norm where you kind of glam up and glitz up stuff, and you've posted stuff just to say, hey guys, I'm not doing well. I don't want to talk about only the good stuff. So kudos to you. Hats off to you for normalizing just regular things for regular people as well, as much as the good things. So had to have you on. Again, very grateful you're taking the time during a very busy schedule for yourself. So I'm gonna get right into this, and I do want to talk to you about some of these amazing awards you have, and I have made a note of this. You have won so many awards. Actually, most recently, the Ladli Foundation Media Award for Gender Sensitivity for your podcast, Be A Man Yaar, which is amazing. That's a huge one to win. You've done so many things. You're on the advisory board of the Gates Foundation. You've won the Goalkeepers Youth Accelerator Award and many more, including when you were at Yash Raj Films. So my first question might be not the easiest one. I do want to ask you what you think is the most impactful work you've been part of, whether at Yuvaa or individually.
Actually, that's easy because for me, it's been teaching. It's been That's always been my answer ever since I became a teacher. I was a professor of news reporting at Jai Hind for in Mumbai for about 7 years. I taught 7 batches, and teaching changed my life because I was one of those teachers. I was one of those young teachers who actually went into teaching thinking that I am going to. I mean, if you see behind me, there is a Robin Williams poster, and his
Oh, yeah.
quote from Dead Poets Society. So I'm a huge fan of that film, and I also had these notions, and I would say magnanimous notions of going and changing the lives of my students,
Yeah.
and but it's actually the reverse that happened because I went there with this understanding that I am going to talk a lot and I get impressed. And then when I started listening, actually is when everything changed for me. I had wanted to just teach them, but I ended up learning a lot. And I feel like
Hmm.
that was really the turning point of my life and my career because uh, we've all been conditioned to look at young people almost either as a consumer or a customer or a demographic,
Hmm.
or in many ways just these entitled people, who have this freedom that we did not have, who have this generational and also youth, honestly, which in
Yeah.
itself is such a big privilege, right? And on the other hand, actually, when you start meaningfully listening to them, when you
Yeah.
give them the respect of listening, uh, they will open up to you and talk about things that are possibly the most vulnerable, the most thoughtful, the most nuanced, the most passionate things that they anyone would ever say in your life. And
Hmm.
that's really what happened in my case. While I was teaching news reporting to them, I started recognizing in my students this pattern where a lot of them would independently come to me, talk about how they're going through tough times with their mental health, but they would just not talk to each other. So I
Hmm.
ended up creating this I created this project in my class called the Kindness Project, where I would create at the end of every semester, like this 2 day period, where I would just listen to them, and I'd say that everyone needs to meaningfully just listen to the stories of my students, of who they are beyond the labels that society has given them. It started, it almost started very accidentally on a rainy day because we didn't have anything else to do. We didn't want to teach. It was raining really heavily outside. Not everybody had come. And then we just accidentally started this off. And then for the next 5 years, this became my calling card as a professor. People used to end up taking journalism so that they could do this class, because in this class they would, for the very first time in their entire lives, actually get to speak about things that they've never spoken to anybody else. So there have been students in my class who have used those classes to come out, students who have spoken about having been sexually assaulted, of seeing domestic violence in their homes, of dealing with drugs, and not just all, and it's not just all harrowing stories. There's just been so many stories of young people who've overcome such tough times in their lives, and then once they express it, everyone around them suddenly is just like, I can't believe that you've said this, because something similar has happened to me too. So there's just empathy that is created, and that empathy is what I learned from those classes, and that's carried me on in my life so far.
That's incredible. I did not know this, and that is such a meaningful. I mean, you're right. That probably beats everything else hands down. And it came to you. You're saying, I mean, almost instinctively, because you realize that they're not getting listened to and not given that kind of safe space. I think a lot of young people lack
Yeah,
that kind of access to a safe space. The Kindness Project, that is very
yeah.
very inspiring. So when you talk about this sort of experience you've been able to create with your students and learning from them, and I recently learned that empathy is actually it's not something we're born with, right? It's something we can choose to exercise empathy. It's something we learn through relationships. And I wonder how important it's been for you to foreground empathy in your career throughout, not just as a teacher. And I think the second part to that is this something you would have benefited from as a student yourself? I mean, did you have access to these kind of conversations and spaces when you were younger?
That's a great question. 100% I would have benefited from it. I feel like in our education system, our teachers aren't trained to be sensitive as human beings. They're trained to be to help get students marks to pass in exams, and a lot of the teachers end up actually doing the opposite of what they're supposed to do, which is to turn us into, to use compassion and kindness to help us become better human beings, not just better students. That is, I would imagine, the job of any good guru that we've had in ancient India from time immemorial, right? uh, and I also understand why, because teachers are just so badly paid. They don't get the respect that they deserve in our society, and because of that, I feel like teaching has now become so capitalized. It's become a form of capitalism. The most successful teachers are just now are doing this for money, because I feel like even they've been failed by the education system. So I think our education system needs an overhaul, so that we are able to help young people uh, recognize what is the meaning of empathy, not only for others but also for themselves, because I feel like that's something that, as a man and as a young boy, is something that I don't think I recognized that I deserved. Uh, because as a man, you're conditioned so hard to constantly be thinking about your job of at some point earning the right kind of money, the right kind of salary, the right kind of uh, you know milestone achievement that can make your parents proud, that will prove that the money that they've invested in you is actually a good return on investment. Because boys are raised to be providers, boys are raised to be, in many ways, there they're not allowed to have self-worth because their self-worth is conflated with their net worth, right? It is such a so I don't even think I understood what empathy meant until I actually started teaching. I would talk about kindness a lot, and kindness for me was very important because, again, as if I feel like as a young person who was trying really hard to make it in the media and entertainment industry, I was constantly judged and looked down upon. That's also because I would want to, I would be ambitious, I would work really hard, I would want to make a name for myself, and that made a lot of older people uncomfortable. And I received some very nasty comments in my workplaces purely for being young. And so I started teaching for that reason, because I wanted to train a new generation of young people to make them believe that whatever they want out of their life is should not be looked down upon, should not be judged. And that kind of led me to somehow recognizing and probably finding, not just creating a safe space for them inadvertently, but also finding a safe space for myself to be able to actually recognize what I feel and what I think. So my understanding of empathy is also actually started from my teaching days. So again, I'm so grateful to my students, and I'm so grateful for them for being vulnerable in front of me, which allowed me to be vulnerable to not just in front of them, but also to myself.
And that's something that's really difficult. I mean, I didn't think of it, with a gender lens. Like, obviously, I think I tend to look at everything from the sort of gender lens of like women and what we, girls have to go
Yeah,
through. And it's after watching your show, listening to some of what you articulate. There's also a young psychologist called Arjun, Knight of Steel, on Instagram, who's talks also about men's mental health. And I'm
yeah,
starting to see that there's so much pressure that's brought to bear. So when we say the patriarchy is bad for everybody, it actually really is.
yeah,
This
yeah,
line you have about self-worth being conflated with net worth, that's so true. And I've also heard from friends that you're also raised, like you said, there is an ROI to your education. There's this idea
yeah,
that you're going to be you have to kind of provide for everyone, so it puts so much pressure on people. But when you look at empathy now as a leader, right, you co-founded a company, you're the chief now. I know there's an interesting leadership transition, I think sometime a few months ago, which is also very unique and very rare. I've been talking to people about how it's hard to let go of power when you have it. So I want to ask you a little bit about being empathetic as a leader versus what sometimes people seem to think, if you're kind or compassionate, that you're kind of a walkover. Can you take us through a little bit about how you show up as a leader for your team, what empathy has to do with it, and how you kind of still have boundaries? How do you lead?
You've already mentioned the last part of in your question, the catch to this, right? How do you be thoughtful about boundaries? So I don't, I failed a lot as a leader in the first couple of years of Yuvaa, because I was all empathy and no boundaries. I kind of thought that it is possible to create a space which purely runs on emotion, right? Where everybody is going to come in and be the most emotional self, be the most empathetic self, and work only with compassion. And then you start seeing people getting burnt out, because it's a real thing called compassion fatigue. You would see some people step in so much more than the others, because there were other people who required that uh, help, because they were possibly in a place of bad mental health more often than the others. And then you'd see the people who are working so much more than the others quickly start feeling that why are they the only ones working? This is also true for most organizations, where 20% of the people do 80% of the work. But when you are specifically in a empathetic organization, quote unquote, it almost becomes it becomes very toxic. And I'm using the word for my own company, but it is, I feel I saw that in year 2, I think sometime in the second year, where I realized very quickly that the answer to any workplace isn't just unlimited empathy. It is empathy with discipline. It is empathy with professionalism. You cannot replace professionalism, discipline, boundaries with this idea of empathy. Empathy as an idea is wonderful, but if you do not know how to apply it, it can actually come back to bite you. Because I've had situations where, and I would even say, I've spoken about some of the other employees who have actually, taken on the burdens of the work of other people who may be at some point not just doing as well. But I've done that in several cases myself. Like, I've seen somebody, I wanted to make sure that my employees aren't working extra hours, as an example, but there's a big pitch to be made, and that the industry doesn't work according to my empathetic standards, right? If they want something, if a client wants something in the morning and they suddenly tell you something in this at 6 o'clock in the evening, you have to find a way of doing it, especially when you're a young startup. So I would send my employees home and I would sit till 3 a.m., 4 a.m. alone, doing those presentations, and after a point of time, I started burning out. So it wasn't a very healthy environment. It took me some time to have that self-awareness to realize that something needs to be done about it. And then started finding I started finding the balance between what the need and requirement for a place to be compassionate, to be empathetic, at the same time to ensuring that we are doing this in the scope of work that we do. The work is still important. We cannot run an organization. We cannot earn money on empathy, right? We cannot have revenues on empathy, even though ours is a for-profit which is focused on social impact. And in fact, one of our commandments at Yuvaa is that our politics is empathy. We kind of work only with companies and only on work that is empathetic in nature. At the same time, we need to do that work professionally, because that's who we are in the workplace. We are professionals. So how do we distinguish between this idea of being good professionals and at the same time as empathetic human beings, which means, as an example, now putting policies in place to ensure that empathy is not just an idea but a discipline. So having menstrual leave, having mental health leave, having no questions asked mental health leave, encouraging people in your organization to taking those leaves when you see them being burnt out, not judging people on a daily basis. Empathy is not just something that happens when someone, when someone requires it. It should be a day in and day out practice. And that kind of takes time, but I feel like I think we are at that place now where we have found that balance. I just want to admit that I wasn't all there right at the beginning. In fact, I failed quite a bit.
I mean, yeah, thank you so much for your honesty. I, by the way, failed as recently as this year. So I will put that out there as well, because I realize, there is, like you just said, there's so many things to think about when you're running a business, and you can't actually make a profit of being empathetic yet. I am holding out for the day when, chief empathy officer is going to be a lucrative position, in the age of AI. But thank you for sharing that, including this no questions asked mental health policy, because I think for other organizations, these are also great examples of how you can, walk the talk and not just have a symbolic, mental health day for awareness, but actually be there for your employees. So let me ask you a little bit. And I was recently watching this wonderful episode you just did with Imran Khan on Be A Man Yaar. So many things to unpack, but I was so, I found it so moving and poignant when you talk to him about his mental health struggles and the way he opens up to you, because you again were able to create this safe space. You're sharing a little bit of what you've gone through, and it's actually, I think, still a little bit of a rarity, for a Bollywood star to talk about. We've had a few famous people talk about mental health struggles, but it's still a very brave thing to do. So, hats off to you and hats off to him. I do want to ask you something you put to him, and if you want to share a little bit about your mental health journey and when you realize that that there should ideally be no stigma or shame in seeking help. There's this question, you both were talking about support systems, and he talks about how at the time when you're going through your difficult periods, it's really important to know who's around you. Are they actually supporting you, or are they kind of eroding your self-worth, is what I think he said. So can you take us through a little bit about that conversation, and then maybe we can segue into your own mental health journey and what's made you such a mental health advocate from the start?
I mean, with Imran, I have to give him so much credit for, you know, can you imagine someone who's at the peak of fame, who's at the peak of success, and is obviously going through some a tough mental health time, but chooses at that point not the money that he's getting, not the fame, not the success, not the star power, not the fandom, but chooses to prioritize his mental health, not only in a way where you're just like, you know what, let me take a holiday and come back after some time, or let me take a 6 month break, or let me take an 8 month break and then come back. He was gone for 8 years. So that obviously tells you that he went through a really, really tough time to be able to be away for so long. And that, can you imagine that, for him to have overcome that and then choose to come back and speak about that? I mean, I find it just so incredibly courageous, not just as a Bollywood star, but also as a human being, to be to use your platform and your privilege to talk about what you've gone through, and so that somewhere somebody else who's watching this may see him and recognize in him the signs they may be having currently, and the fact that there is someone who they may look up to who has struggled and gotten to the other side is also very hopeful as a thing to have, right? And honestly, for me, it was very much the same. I mean, I've not gone through something as tough as he has. At the same time, I cannot diminish what I went through. I was diagnosed with clinical anxiety when I was also in the film industry. I was working at Yashaj at that time. I was also at in very much the peak of what my career was. In no way is it similar to that of Imran, but at the same time, I was a very young, you know, I was 30. I had been promoted to GM at Yashraj. I'd been given a cabin at work. I was a hotshot creative executive in the film and entertainment industry. And as someone who's been an outsider, that's a pretty massive thing. I'd come to Bombay just 9 years before that, and yet I had. My understanding of mental health till that point was mental health issues happen to those. Of course, this is a very naive understanding, right? But you did not have these conversations at that time. So my understanding was that mental health things happen to those who are going through a low in their life. But I was here at a place where I had achieved so many things, and yet I was diagnosed with clinical anxiety. And in therapy, which again took me a long time to get to, I recognize that so much of what I am going through is because of uh, patriarchy that had been conditioned into me, where I measured my entire self worth on the basis of achievements. And I was always, in many ways, Amrita, postponing my happiness, in a way that, when I hit this milestone, I will celebrate, and then you hit that milestone, you're like, I mean, there's so much more to do. I've hit here, but like, look at everybody else around me. What am I still doing? Is this really the time to celebrate? Is this really the time to feel joyful, or should just put your head down and work on the next thing, because there is a next thing to work on. And so I would not even really take the time to have those. I mean, my mini celebrations would just literally be just going out and eating and having a meal with my wife, or just ordering McDonald's. Junk food was my celebration. But outside of that, I don't think that I spent any time meaningfully feeling happy, because I always thought that happiness is a goal to achieve versus an everyday journey. And because of that, when I had reached the age of 30 and I'd gotten a bunch of these markers of success, I ended up breaking a little bit inside, because sometimes when you get what you want, helps you realize that it is not enough, and you are not going to. It's not the answer. You can have X amount of achievements. You can buy yourself that house that you wanted. You can buy yourself those car that you wanted. You can get the designation that you wanted. It is still not going to make up for a lack inside of you. And where does that lack come from? It comes from years and years of never expressing yourself, years and years of repressing any moment of joy or any moment of grief, because you just have to, as a man, really put your head down and work on the next thing. So I remember that there are times when, I had tough phases, in my life with my family going through things, and for me, it was always about carrying on, because that's what you're told as a man, right? Like, just carry on, put your head down, carry on, and then your body gives up. You're just like, I can't carry on. How do I carry on? Anxiety, honestly, and therapy made me realize that um, I was chasing this idea of happiness that would come across after these markers of success and these milestones. But I'd never really taken the time to sit back and think for myself, what is my story outside of the story that is given to me by society? Who am I? Who am I outside of the work I do? Which is like, when we talk to each other, whenever you introduce each other, the first question that you ask is like, what do you do? No one ever asks each other, even like people that you meet for the first time, how are you doing? That's never a question that anyone meaningfully asks. It's always, what do you do? Or even if you're being introduced at a party, it's always like, this is Nikhil and this is what he does. this is Nikhil, he's a good person. As an example, it's never a sentence that anybody says out meaningfully. Why? Because we don't talk to we don't talk about people, and especially men, in human terms. We only talk about people in the terms of, as I said, like their net worth, their value to society, and the amount of money they're making, or the designation they have. And it took me a sabbatical and some time away. I quit my job at a very successful time in my life. Took about 8 months off. Spent some time with myself, took a lot more therapy, and then that led to Yuvaa. It led to me starting a company where I thought that I want to use, I want to do things now meaningfully, versus
That's
just blindly.
That's incredible. And I want to ask you about Yuva's mission. But thank you so much for sharing that. And I also did love in that interview, you start by asking Imran, how are you? And I think you're right.
Yeah,
Nobody asks how are you waiting to hear how the other person is, right? It's just like even if you say how are you, it's usually like just a filler. But I really, it's really moving what you just shared, and how you really have been building around this, this understanding that you have of mental health struggles. And I really appreciate your sharing that. I do want to ask you something though. When we talk to, or anyone who's listening to this, for example, when you talk about um, markers of success, and we talked about your amazing awards and these achievements, and you were at the peak of one career there, GM at 30, by the way, with your own cabin. I mean, it's ridiculous. That's like just that it doesn't get better than that. It does feel like we put so much pressure on people to reach these fancy designations, and then there's no guide to how to navigate even
yeah,
success. There's no guide to navigate success. There's no guide to navigate office politics. What happens when you're actually, you hear that old apocryphal, it's lonely at the top. um, I had a couple of big jobs in my life. One of the big jobs, when I first quit a news channel, I was an anchor, and it's around the same age. I think I was 31 or something, and I was like, "This, I want to find out what else I want to do in life." And I remember still two friends, and I thought this was a very Delhi thing, but since you're in Mumbai, I think it's just a universal thing. I had a couple of friends who said, "Oh, you're not important anymore because you've
yeah,
nobody knows what you're doing." And I was like, that was a friend, and I was like, ouch, that kind of, my ego took a hit. I had to sit and really think about, wait, what does this mean? If if you believe it, your self-worth will plummet, right? And you kind of have to remind yourself what actually matters. So it's not a Delhi thing, clearly. When
I'm
you
gonna just tell you. I want to share an instance because that reminds me that 9 months after I had quit my job at Yashraj, and just a month into starting Yuva, I had gone to possibly my first gathering of people in like 8 to 9 months, where a very dear friend of mine, it was a friend in the media and entertainment industry, and the funniest thing that happened that time was he went around introducing me to everyone as, this is Nikhil. He used to work at Yash Raj Films. There was no mention of, this
you
is Nikhil and he's my friend, or he's, whatever, he's a producer, as an example, or the fact that he's just started a company of his own. It was such an interesting thing to see that even
yeah,
for the people that, who you are friends with, also almost see you and see your worth in society as through your designation. So they're introducing you to
yeah.
people who they think are important by trying to explain that this guy used to be important. And it was like,
That's why I brought him. That's why I wanted to meet him. He used
can
to.
you
We'll
imagine?
see
Yeah.
what happens. But oh man, that is it's such human nature though. And I sometimes wonder, like, you have to check yourself also sometimes, right? When you're all of this also means that we have to also look at how we judge ourselves internally, how we assign value, and it takes a lot of unlearning to distance yourself from just what you do. I think that is a tricky thing for young people who are listening, or young people you talk to and work with, because it's not like this system has gotten any easier. If anything, it's gotten hyper competitive. It's actually it's very difficult. Whatever career people are choosing right now, it could be engineering, it could be you were an engineer. I mean, I didn't even know this until I was googling you. It's very competitive, right? And you always have these, like, you see the stories of the high achievers who tend to be the outliers, but you start judging yourself based on that.
Yeah.
For young people you work with, I'm curious to know, what do they think when they hear about how you decided to quit at the peak of one career? And of course, you've gone on to huge success, which we'll talk about. But what would your advice be to anyone? I mean, it's also a place of privilege to say, I can quit this. Maybe you've saved
Yeah.
enough. Maybe you have. Um,
Yeah.
how do you advise people who come to you who are younger, maybe, and
Yeah.
struggling?
No, it is absolutely a privilege. I was able to quit because I did have a little bit of savings, but second, my wife was earning, and this is where I'm so grateful to my wife to have taken up the burden of running our household for those 8 months where I was not bringing in a salary. And she was very supportive and she told me that you take your time and it's okay. You're going to be okay. And thanks to her, I was able to focus on my mental health and then I was able to start my new journey. So, you do need people who support you if you're trying to make a decision as big as that. I've always told young people that uh, I think the way that they should and possibly could look at their careers are, and what I feel, is also true, is that do things in the phases that mean something to you, right? Because there are going to be phases where you're going to feel very inspired and very passionate and very energetic. You might feel like in those phases of just hardcore youth energy, if I may call it that, where you may feel like I want to make something of myself, and it could be a 8 month phase, it could be a 2 year phase, it could be a 2.5 year phase. Go for it, work as hard as you can in that time where you're feeling the will to. But if you reach a place where you also feel that the need to slow down, listen to your body and your mind at that point of time. Because I feel like, I've been telling myself, forget like telling, I've learned this from my own self, right? I have tried very hard to kind of find that balance on a daily basis or weekly basis, and it does work to some capacity. But I've also realized that it's not fair for me to tell this to younger people who have not really made something out of themselves. I also feel like it is so important to, at the time where you have the capacity to push yourself and to get that money that is going to save you, that's going to help you through tough phases in your life, make that money at that point of time, right? Except of course, don't do it with such a hustle mentality where you're not giving any time to yourself. But yes, in those phases where I feel like if you have the energy and the capacity to push yourself, get the dream job that you want, reach out to the innovate, create something that you're proud of, and then if you feel that I feel like I need a little bit of a break, don't be afraid of that break as well, because you're going to get back on track very soon and you will have another burst of energy at that point of time. So this is what I typically tell, because I feel like just saying a blanket, find a way of building breaks into your life, I don't think that's a fair thing to say to someone who's not earning as much money as you are
Yeah.
today, or you must have in your life.
Yeah, no, I love that. That's really nuanced and helpful. I will say with young people I've met, I think they're much better about money though than I think our generation, well, my generation was.
100%.
It's
100%.
inspiring. And sometimes frustrating because I'm like, oh my God, and it's more like, damn, like how stupid was I, you know? But
I'm so with you. I relate so hard to that. Yeah.
so when we take us through a little bit about this, the mission for Yuvaa. It's been now several years, and congratulations on all the incredible moments. I saw that lovely post of you're hoarding at Times Square. Like that's huge. You're on a billboard with your show, Be A Man Yaar. You have if there's been funding with the Adobe Foundation. Take us through a little bit about what was the mission, the purpose, and where you reached now. What is the focus going to be?
Yeah. The mission was very simple. I realized during the time that I went through anxiety that I did not have a support system for myself. I did not have enough conversations about mental health to even be to overcome the stigma to go to therapy, which actually was the thing that was life changing for me, that made me the person I am today. I always keep joking about this in my conversations that my propaganda is therapy. I just, any chance I get, any point of time, anywhere, it could be an offline conversation, online conversation, it could be with students, it could be with the, corporate professionals, and I will just name drop therapy and say why it is the most important thing that you must do in your life. But yeah, it took me some time to recognize what I was going through was anxiety, and and then through my students I realized that they've not had safe spaces at all. And at those point of time, again, we didn't have those terms of safe spaces. These are terms that we are now, this is vocabulary that we are learning over the last 2 to 3 years. This vocabulary did not exist, so it may have existed, but it was still a privileged understanding. It wasn't something that was accessible to a lot more people. So I wanted to start a company that would listen to young people. I felt like the greatest thing that I found in my students was that they were not being heard, they were not being given the respect of being heard. And if we could actually create a platform that doesn't just talk to young people, that doesn't just create a one way communication, but actually goes to them, hears out what their issues are, and then tries to create solutions and creative solutions to those issues that we can show back to them, so that they may feel less lonely. So it was a very simple thing. How do we make young Indians feel less lonely? That was really the big core question of what we wanted to try to fix at Yuva, or try to understand and try to work on at Yuva. And so, to that effect, even in the first year, before we had an Instagram page, before we had, we had an office space, we did something. We embarked on whatever little money that we had raised. It was a friends and family fund that we had raised to, get an office space, get our first few employees. We used that money to go across the country on something called the Yuva Roadshow of Kindness, where I traveled to about 100 plus colleges. I went to over 35 cities. I met over 10,000 young people over a course of 6 to 8 months. I went to IITs, IIMs, AIMS, NITs, NIFTs, government institutions, private institutions, and just listened. So I would go, I would tell my story of what I've gone through in with my mental health journey, and then I would create a space and I would say that, okay, you've heard me non-judgmentally. Now I would like to create a space where I hear you non-judgmentally. So if you feel that you're okay with expressing, please do express. And then we heard so many students speak about so many tough issues. And then we recognize that these are the problems that our country is going through. Because when you hear Young India, you actually get a very, very, very honest and truthful glimpse of what the larger issues of India are. So, as an example, the number one thing that women would talk about inevitably, no matter where you would go in our country, was sexual harassment. And this is 2018-19, right? Like, this problem has persisted, no, in every generation. But now at least women are being super vocal about it. So you would go to the south, you go to the east, you go to the north, and every second, third woman who would come up, she would speak about harassment. She would speak about harassment in the colleges they are, outside, in their homes sometimes. It was disheartening. At the same time, you saw a lot of community that was building with women, supporting women. So they would speak about these tough times. At the end of that conversation, then immediately give a shout out to some other girl who's been there for them. And it was so beautiful to see that, there's a girl coming in on stage and crying and saying, this is what I've gone through. And there's some other girl running to hug her, and the sisterhood that was formed. On the other hand, boys, when you give them a space, first they're not able to talk about their feelings, right? So they make jokes. They would either talk about heartbreak or romance, because that is the only emotion that has been normalized in teenage boys to be, that is acceptable for them to talk about. If they would talk about careers and failures, they would choke up. And it's only when boys felt very, very safe that they would actually talk about what the core issue, I feel, that I've seen among young men, which is that of loneliness. They would talk about how lonely they are. I have been to colleges, Amrita, where young men have come up to me saying, can I have a hug? And I've given them a hug, and then they've told me, this is the first hug I have received in my entire life. I have had young men tell me that nobody in their entire life, including their parents, has said, I love you to them. There were a couple of boys who came and told me that they've never received touch. Like, nobody has touched them. And this is where, when I do Be A Man Yaar, it's so interesting. And just coming to me, Nasiruddin Shah spoke about the same thing. He said, मेरे बाप ने मुझे मेरे वालिद साहब ने मुझे बचपन के बाद छुआ ही नहीं. Like, he has never received any physical intimacy from his father. And this is the case with most young men in our country. So once you start understanding these issues of young people, then we came back and decided that, okay, here's the top issues that young people are going through. Can we find brands? Can we find nonprofits? Can we find, policy makers who we can partner with on trying to address these issues? So some of that intervention becomes something like a Be A Man Yaar, which is a chat show on positive masculinity, where we bring men to talk about, to be vulnerable, so that other young men who may be going through this now recognize that men can create safe spaces among themselves. You don't have to wait for somebody else to create that for you, because that's what I saw. I saw lonely young men everywhere, but no young man actually supporting each other's mental health journey, or creating or providing emotional support to each other. On the other hand, some of these interventions can be on-ground campus interventions. So, for example, we've done interventions with L'Oreal, where we have gone with Navya Nanda across to talk about, street harassment and training young people on street harassment. We have worked with Maybelline on training young people on on creating mental health toolkits. So we've gone with like 16 psychologists to 50,000 young people and given them their first understanding of mental health. We have partnered with Tinder, gone on ground to talk about consent. So we have gamified consent so that young men, women, and all other genders can recognize what that means. So we have done offline, online, short format, long format, short films, podcasts, whatever it takes to for us to be able to create to solve some of those problems in whatever meaningful way that we can.
That is so inspiring. And I'm so glad. I mean, so many, many, many more thousands of brands and dollars and, whatever you need, and people, who are aligned, because I think that you're absolutely right. I think when you put it that way of like listening to what the problems are first and then going and trying to meet people where they are instead of just saying, oh my God, this is, it's our first reaction tends to be to judge. But if you can actually meet people where they are and find a way for communities to form, we've seen that to be very powerful, especially in the mental health space. So, hats off to you and your team. That's awesome. And these brands who are supporting you. I think that's fantastic. Okay, as we wind down, because I'm very mindful of the time, I want to ask you a couple of quick questions. They can be quick or slow, depending on your schedule. One is, do you have a favorite interviewee over the years, or maybe for this year? It's hard to pick over all of the interviews you've done, but who's your favorite
I
interview
mean,
this year?
it's very easy for me because this year it was Bhuvan Bam. It is possibly not just a conversation I'm proud of as a host of a chat show, but a conversation I'm proud of as a human being. Uh, Bhuvan ended up speaking in my conversation about what he saw as alcohol addiction in his father.
Yeah.
And it was unexpected that he would bring it up. I nudged him about why he doesn't drink, because that is something that he just happened to mention. I mean, he's mentioned in a couple of interviews, and I was very curious that as a young
Mm.
boy growing up in a Delhi environment, and how is he not doing those things that boys do to fit in? And is there a story there? So I nudged him to understand, like, why do you not smoke? Why do you not drink? And he just spoke a little bit about he's seen that at home, and I asked him if he's comfortable sharing, and then he just opened up. He spoke about things that would be too hard for people to speak about to their closest friends, and on camera he spoke very, very deeply, very honestly, very vulnerably about what he saw in his life and how alcohol nearly destroyed his family. And to have somebody at that level, Bhuvan
Yeah.
Bam is the hugest young star among
Yeah.
a certain age of young people in our country, people who have millennials who have grown up watching him, and Gen Zs today who are still huge fans of him. And for him to bring that bravery to a
Yeah.
conversation, and then there was a moment in that conversation. Bhuvan lost his parents during the pandemic, and I asked him if he's comfortable speaking about it. And he just paused, and he welled up. And it was a 1 minute pause that everybody on the internet is now, talking about, which we retained in its entirety. And I did not fill in that silence. He did not say something which was meaningless. We just
Yeah.
both waited, until he was ready to speak again. And then he chose to speak about something, and that's when we continued the conversation from there. And so for me, that's the essence of what Be A Man Yaar is, right? When he wanted to speak about what he thought was addiction in his family, I listened and I gave him the space to speak. And when he needed the space to be silent, uh, our show was able to provide that space for him to be silent. And for me, that is really the essence of what we can do as caregivers, as supporters, as as empathetic listeners to people in our
Yeah.
lives. It's You don't always need to respond. You do not always need to react. You do not always need to say something wise or something funny or something smart. Sometimes you just need to keep quiet and listen and just be there, until the other person is comfortable either sharing or not. So I'm really, really proud of that episode. That episode's,
It's
our most
incredible.
viral episode is at 1.3
Yeah.
million views. It went
Yeah.
insanely viral on social media, and for good reason. I
Yeah.
cannot imagine a person like that opening up in this way.
Yeah, very courageously and very authentically. And you're absolutely right. So anyone who's not watched it, please go check that out on the Yuvaa channel. Be a Man Yaar is very easy to find because it's very popular. So I hope you get more viewers and listeners because, like you said, it opens up space for other people. That's what we've seen, through any of the mental health advocacy work we've done. Anyone with lived experience who shares, and
Absolutely.
it takes so much courage in this country still. I mean, that includes you, that includes your guests. It takes a lot of courage even today in India. And I think it does open space for other people. It's an art what you're doing, and I think the fact that you're able to hold silence also, and most of us tend to jump to try and say, how can I solve this, all right, or how can I provide some sort of solution, and people sometimes just want you to listen without judging. Okay, I have two more questions for you. One is, you're not old enough for this question, but I just spoke to a couple of guests. I said, I'm not going to be sexist and only ask the women how they, because I'm basically dealing with my midlife crisis by putting my guests on the spot to be like, how are you dealing with aging? So you're not, I would ideally ask this when you're post 40, but I have to not be sexist myself. So how do you feel about aging? How do you think we are, because all of a sudden we're all constantly performing, right, on social law, whether we think we are or not. There's this level of like performance that has come in. Have you thought about aging? Does it bother you? What's your relationship with the whole process?
I just want to say it's so funny that the first person who's telling me you might be too old for this, or too
Too
young
young
for
for
this.
this. Yeah.
Sorry, yeah, you might be someone who's saying who's too young for this, because I've constantly been, because my average age at Yuvaa is 25, so I am
Yeah.
on a daily basis too old for things. And now for the first time I'm hearing you might be too young for this question. I'm like, oh wow, that's a relief. No, I
Always here
you
to
know
help you feel younger. I'm cultivating older friends. You should also cultivate older friends. It's one way to stay young.
Absolutely, absolutely. No, I mean, I've literally started a company called Yuvaa to stay young. I mean, I don't know what else I can do. And literally, I identify as Yuvaa. So,
Yes.
um, I feel, I mean, it's a great question again. I feel like uh, I did not understand what being old meant until, I started seeing my parents get older. And until I've started seeing, them go through illnesses. Uh, when life starts happening to you, I think that's when you realize you're old. I don't think that as a person inside I feel any older than I did a few years ago. Perhaps a little wiser about who I am and who I am not. uh, but at the same time, do I feel lesser energy than I had earlier in trying to go after the things that I care about? Not really. Does my body disagree? 100%. Does my hairline disagree? 100%. And I feel like that's always the contextualization you need to make about aging, right? You may feel a different way inside, and you may look a different way outside. And then you need to recognize that the way people perceive you may not actually be the way that you're feeling inside. And I've started recognizing that little bit more deeper, because till a very long time, I did not see anybody having any discomfort in coming and talking to me, right? It was always like, if I'm at a party, or if I'm at a gathering, or even at my office, when I had the first few employees of Yuva when I was 33, I mean, we started 30, yeah, but 32, 33. It was always a very open environment. And now I've started noticing that people are a little bit more reluctant. And I've, when I have conversations with younger folks, they tell me that, I always thought you should have attitude, or I was very afraid of coming up to you. And I wonder why. And then I realized, because I'm old. It is,
Older,
it's just
older,
one of
not
those
old.
things. Yeah. I mean, yeah, it's older, right? Like, and you have
Yeah.
to make your peace with that. So
Yeah.
you have to now be that person who possibly goes up to the younger people and says, hi, I am Nikhil, what's your name? Because you have to realize that there is a power dynamic now, there is an age
Yeah.
dynamic now, and you have to be careful about that. So I think those things are the things that I'm now recognizing, that the way that people look at me and the way I feel inside, there is definitely a dissonance there. And I have to understand that dissonance. And I suppose that is adulting in some way, right? That is being an
Yeah.
adult, that sense of maturity.
I'm going to come back to you post 40, because, as I said, the caveat for this whole thing is you're not old enough for this conversation yet. But I appreciate that, and I like what you said about being more comfortable with who you are, like knowing who you are more. This is a good thing I'm seeing, possibly the only good thing I will tell you from the other side of 40. But okay, final question, and this is with a shout out again to my friend and colleague Sai, who said it might be nice to ask your guests what's the one thing or two things they're grateful for as you end the episode.
Oh wow. I mean, I'm very grateful for my family. Honestly, it is. I am I have had I've had challenges in my upbringing, which I feel like everybody kind of has. Uh, but I know it's not because of the lack of intent; it was the lack of awareness. Uh, and I'm just so grateful that my parents, my brother, my wife, my Masi, people who are closest to me, are constantly trying to do better with the people they love around them. Everybody is constantly trying to improve themselves, to somehow be kinder to the other person than they were before. So it's not that we don't have fights anymore. It's that our fights are gentler and our fights are infrequent, because there is a sense that we must be there for each other as a family. So I'm really grateful for that. What else am I grateful for? I would say the youth of our country. I feel like I get very inspired by young people. I see a passion in them to change things, to not accept the status quo, to want better, and they demand better, and they're not afraid of canceling others and or being cancelled, which again I find admirable. So far, it's not. I've not been on that side, so I'm happy to support them from a distance. But yeah, there is. I think they are great. They're more passionate and they're more compassionate, and I really appreciate that, and I wish that I always look at that and try to almost emulate that in my own life. Can I also use my experience to help guide them? Can I use my privilege and my position of power to give whatever platforms that I can and pass on the mic to them? Yes, that's what I want to do. At the same time, I'm also trying very hard to learn from newer thoughts, newer ideologies, and the passion and energy of young people, to be able to do better in my life, and never to genuinely, even if I look older, not be an old person, which
Yeah,
is
like don't be that
grumpy. Yeah.
cranky
But-
uncle.
but-
Yeah.
yeah, uncle. I don't. I'm happy being old. I'm never happy being. I don't ever want to be an uncle. Yeah.
I love that. That is so great. And I do love that you have Robin Williams on your wall. I think your "Oh Captain, my Captain" spirit comes through very beautifully, and I think you're inspiring a lot of us. So keep doing what you're doing. Thank you so much for taking the time again, and more power to you and your mission. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Amrita. I'm so grateful to being here. I think, yeah, that's the note I should end on. I'm also very grateful for being listening to you and speaking to you. That's something that I didn't know it would happen so soon. But yeah, thank you
I'm
for
so
having
glad.
me.
Thank you. Again, I'm going to clip this for my imposter syndrome moments. This is what's going to happen here. Thanks so much.